No, Secretary General, thanks a million for doing this. You'll see on the screen my co-host, Ben Wheeler.
So there are two hosts.
Yep, because you've got the very old generation, in my case, and you've got, as you can see, the younger successor generation. So, Secretary General, your time is limited, I know that very well, so we'll get straight to it. Good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to our audience from NATO headquarters for our second podcast in the series NATO Through Time, where we're looking at NATO's long and rich anniversary year, 75 years of the alliance, a lot of history, but not just the history, but more the relevance to that history to NATO's current challenges and future. I'm Jamie Shea. I said when we recorded our first podcast that we would be having some special guests as we go along. And I'm absolutely delighted that today we have one of those very special guests, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. He comments all of the time on the current political issues of the alliance on a daily basis. But today we're going to ask him informally to sort of step back a little bit and give us his sense of his time of 10 years as Secretary General, when he's lived through a lot of NATO history and arguably perhaps the most challenging times of all for NATO. And again, I'm privileged to be the co-host of the podcast today, and I welcome in Chicago very early in the morning my co-host Ben Wheeler.
Yes, hello, Mr. Secretary General. Jamie, it's nice to see you again. I'm so glad to be back, and I'm really excited, Mr. Secretary General, get to know about your personal journey about becoming the Secretary General and how your understanding of NATO has changed over time. So I guess my first question is, for people who don't know, what is it that you do as a Secretary General? What does your job entail?
So fundamentally, I do at least two things. The first thing I do is to lead what we call the North Atlantic Council, and that's the council where all now the 32 NATO allies meet, either with the ambassadors, as we do several times a week, or the ministers from all the 32 allies, or roughly once a year, heads of state and government, as the president and prime ministers, when they meet, be it as ambassadors or ministers or heads of state and government, they meet in what we call the North Atlantic Council. And that's the body that takes all the decisions in NATO, big and small, and I share that body. So I'm the chairman of the North Atlantic Council, and my main responsibility is to ensure that NATO is able to take decisions. So I negotiate compromises, and I find, and I also put forward my own proposals to ensure that we're able to adapt and respond as NATO have to do. The other thing I do is to be the leader or the kind of CEO of the NATO staff. There are thousands of people, and just in this building there are roughly 2,000 or something people working for the NATO staff, and I'm responsible for that organization. And then I also have a kind of third task, and that is to be the main kind of spokesperson. So I speak on behalf of the alliance. So these are the three main things I do.
Secretary General, you were Prime Minister of Norway and for a long period, and you were well known not just as a very successful Norwegian politician, but also internationally, your work for the United Nations. There's probably a lot of things that you could have done after serving as Prime Minister. So when you had the invitation to become Secretary General of NATO, what attracted you to NATO? Was it just the sense of duty to serve, or was there something particularly about NATO which took your interest and made you want to sort of come to Brussels? So in a nutshell, why did you take the job?
To be honest, I was very much in doubt. I was approached early January 2014 about the question of whether I was ready to become Secretary General of NATO. I talked to my father because he had been Minister of Defense and Foreign Affairs in Norway for many years, so he knew NATO well. And he said something like that, no, I don't think you should do that because so quiet, nothing happens in NATO. And then while I was considering this, suddenly things started to happen. Because then suddenly we went from a relatively good relationship with Russia to Russia annexing Crimea and taking parts of East and Donbass. And suddenly, out of nowhere, ISIS suddenly were able to control large parts of Iraq and Syria and was launching terrorist attacks against NATO allies. So then we all realized that from being not a quiet place, but at least not as busy as NATO become after these events. So I answered yes. I also answered yes because to be asked by President Obama, to be asked by Chancellor Merkel, of course, it's very hard to say no.
It is really a great honor to be elected as the next Secretary General of NATO, this unique alliance. And I will do my utmost to live up to that honor.
But I have to admit that my plan was either to then stay in Norwegian politics. I'd been Prime Minister for 10 years, but I was considering to run again. and if I was going to go to an international position, I was thinking more about climate change, because climate change has been in a way my main issue, and I was the UN envoy on climate change. So I was a bit, if you had asked me late 2013, I would say, no, I will never be Secretary General of NATO, but I ended up, and I don't regret, because I have been Secretary General in a very pivotal time for this alliance.
And you also, of course, put climate change on the NATO agenda, so you succeeded in getting your will in the end. If you allow me just one quick anecdote, you said your father advised you not to go to Brussels because it could be rather boring. It reminds me of when Lord Carrington, one of your predecessors as Secretary General, stood down, and then Manfred Werner came along from Germany as his successor, and the Berlin Wall came down, and Carrington phoned Werner up one day and said, "Oh, Manfred, I told you not to go to Brussels, it would be so boring, but had I known that this was going to happen, I would never have left."
Before serving as Secretary General, government in Norway was kind of like a family affair. And so if your father was the defense minister and the foreign minister, your mom was a policy expert, what did you learn about NATO from them? And growing up, I mean, you kind of grew up during a very influential time in NATO. How did this impact your understanding, and what did you learn about it then?
We like the personal touches. I
grew up, I'm born in 1959, and I grew up in a family which has always been very political. As you said, my father was a Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was State Secretary, Deputy Minister, many ministers for many years, and my mother was also Deputy Minister for some time, and she was a very strong feminist in Norway, working on kindergartens and parental leave and also same-sex marriages. So they were both very political. But they were also both strong supporters of NATO throughout their life. They were Social Democrats from the kind of labor movement in Norway, but at the same time strong supporters of NATO, as the whole Labour Party was. And actually, their honeymoon was, when they were married back in 1956, was to go to Vienna in Austria, and then to go to the border of Hungary, and to help Hungarians who were also fleeing the Russian invasion of Budapest or Hungary in 1956. We had a Budapest uprising. I think it was in October, or at least the fall of 56. And they spent months there, crossing into Hungary, helping people out. And I still have Hungarian friends who actually were helped by my parents and other Norwegian friends to get to Austria first, and then later to Norway. So they were really strong believers in the transatlantic bond. In the idea, so I learned in a way to like NATO. But then I joined the Young Labour Party, and the Young Labour Party, in opposition to the Labour Party, also the Labour Party was always strongly in favour of NATO, while the Young Labour Party that I joined in 1973, we were against NATO. So in my first years as a young politician, I was part of an organisation that was opposing its mother party, the Labour Party, and opposing also then NATO. But then when I grew up in this young Labour Party, the Social Democratic Youth Organization in Norway, I actually realized that I disagreed with the position of my organization. So I often say that there is hardly anyone in Norway who has fought so hard for NATO than I have.
Yeah. Was that due to your military service, Secretary General, when you were conscripted in the Norwegian Army, or was there other reasons that explain why suddenly you saw NATO in a more positive light?
I guess it was very much because of my parents, to be honest. It was not because of my military service. I served 1 year as a conscript in Norway. But it is because I just didn't believe in the idea that Norway could stand alone. I believe in the NATO solidarity. And actually, as a social democrat, it's easy to understand that being together, standing together, we are stronger than alone. Yeah. And therefore, I actually decided to launch a big campaign inside the youth organization, the Young Labour Party. And then in 1987, I was able to turn them from no to NATO to yes to NATO. And since then, I have, of course, been an even stronger supporter of NATO.
Well, that also gives you a sort of great credentials, of course, to be invited to be Secretary General as well. Recently, Sweden has joined the alliance. The flag has gone up just a few yards from us outside NATO headquarters. It's also been a year where, for example, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic have been celebrating 25 years of the alliance. But we hear Mr. Putin often inveigh against NATO enlargement as if that's the cause of all of the current security woes in Europe. So as somebody who has shaped the enlargement process, you played a key role with Finland and Sweden, of course. How do you see the way in which enlargement has changed the alliance? And what do you say to some of my students, for example, who always ask me as their professor, is NATO enlargement really responsible for the way in which Russia has developed?
First of all, I think we need to understand that NATO enlargement is not NATO in a way moving aggressively east, as it sometimes is depicted by Moscow, but it's the East wanting to join NATO. It's the Czech Republic or Poland or the Baltic countries. They wanted, when they got their freedom and they became democratic, independent, sovereign states after the end of the Cold War and the end of the Warsaw Pact, then they decided to join NATO, to aspire for NATO membership, and we said our door is open, you are welcome, you can come in. So this whole perception that in a way NATO is forcing its ways towards the borders of Russia is wrong. It's those countries who make their own free, independent choices, and that's not a threat to Russia. It is building a security institution that preserves peace, a defensive security institution. And this idea that if countries close to Russia's border join NATO, that's a danger. Well, I'm from Norway, and Norway is the only country that was a founding member of NATO back in 1949 that bordered then the Soviet Union. And Moscow, Joseph Stalin, he didn't like that. He said it was a provocation, a threat. But I'm very happy that Washington, London, Paris, the big powers in NATO at that time, said no, if Norway wants to join, it's for Norway to decide. Moscow cannot decide what Norway can do or not do. So the whole idea of that Russia wants to deny countries like Ukraine, also Finland and Sweden, to join NATO, is the idea that they want to re-establish some kind of spheres of influence, where big powers can decide what smaller neighbors can do or not do. We don't want to live in that world. We want to live in a world where free, independent nations take their own democratic free choices, and if they want to join, they can join. If they don't want to join, we absolutely respect that too.
It's their choice, Secretary General, first and foremost.
The purpose of NATO is not actually to fight the war, but it is to prevent the war. And to ensure that any potential adversary knows that an attack on one ally will be an attack on all. And as long as they understand that and we stand together, there will be no military attack on any NATO ally. So that's the reason. why we have lasted so long, and not only lasted long, but why so many countries want to join us. Because when NATO was established, we were 12 members. Then at the end of the Cold War, we were 16. And then since the Cold War, so since the end of the Cold War, the number of NATO allies have doubled from 16 to now 32. And a club that more and more people countries like to join, is a proof in itself that something works. And of course, this is about bringing North America and Europe together, because as long as we stand together, we are 50% of the world's military might, 50% of the world's economic might. So standing together, we will continue to be safe.
Secretary General, we're looking a lot at the history, and thank you very much also for being ready to do that. But I know that Ben, particularly representing a younger generation than I, wants to ask you a little bit about NATO's future. So Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the past, but what does the future hold for NATO? Are there future enlargements inbound? Perhaps you kind of maxed out in Europe, but perhaps across the Pacific, even though I guess it violates the initial 2 letters of the acronym?
Well, I think there will be more enlargements, and we are working hard to get Ukraine in. We have all agreed that Ukraine will become a NATO ally, and we have helped to move Ukraine closer to NATO membership than ever before.
We reaffirmed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO and agreed to remove the requirement for a membership action plan. This would change Ukraine's membership path from a 2-step process to a 1-step process. We also made clear that we will issue an invitation for Ukraine to join NATO when allies agree and conditions are met.
But I don't believe that we will change the NATO treaty and the whole idea of NATO. NATO is and should remain a North Atlantic organization, North America, US and Canada, together with European allies. So collective defense, Article 5, will apply for NATO allies in Europe and North America. We will have partners in Asia or in Latin America and Africa and many other places. But NATO should remain an alliance of North America and Europe, and that's also enshrined in our founding treaty, the Washington Treaty. So yes, I think there will be more enlargement, but with European countries, not beyond Europe.
The 75th anniversary is going to be marked by this summit in Washington, where the treaty was signed in April 1949, this coming July. I suppose, Secretary General, that being the 75th anniversary, being back at the home of the alliance, being in the United States and in the election year, with everything that's happening with Ukraine at the moment, with NATO's collective defence, all of the things, of course, that you've steered, it has to be, I suppose, a special summit, a historic summit. So would you be willing to share with the audience a sort of a preview of what you hope to get out of the summit? It's probably, if I may say so, also likely to be your last as Secretary General, unless you asked yet again to stay on as you have in the past. We'll have to wait and see. But can you sort of give us a sense, as I said, of what's on the agenda and what would satisfy you as Secretary General in terms of the outcome?
So first, this will be a celebration summit. We're going to celebrate the 75th anniversary, and it's great to do it in Washington, where the alliance was founded, and we are going to mark that in a very good way in Washington with President Biden as the host. Then, of course, we also need substance, and I expect that when leaders meet in Washington, they will make new decisions on strengthening our deterrence and defense. We are now implementing the biggest reinforcement of NATO's collective defense in decades, and allies are also spending significantly more on defense. When we made the pledge to spend 2% of GDP on defense, we made that pledge in 2014. Only 3 allies spent 2% of GDP on defense. This year I expect 2/3. We'll have final numbers closer to the summit, but 2/3 of allies to meet that commitment, and the rest to be are coming closer. And and closer. I also expect to make important decisions on support to Ukraine and to make that support more robust and long-term. So I hope that allies can agree on that. And then thirdly, it's important for NATO to work closer with partners, the European Union. We have partners in the Middle East, but I also believe strongly that we should do more together with our Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, because even though NATO should remain a regional alliance, this region, the North Atlantic, faces global threats, including the rise of China. So we need, which is more and more aligned with Russia. So therefore, we need a global approach and work with partners all over the world.
Ben, you're a young American. Well, you still look very young, and you're sitting in Chicago. And so the summit's going to be on your side of the pond, as we say in my country, the Atlantic. So as a young American, what's your sort of perception of NATO and the Washington summit? And perhaps the Secretary General will respond to sort of your impression of this.
I'm looking forward to it. But I guess my question is, how can you convince perhaps politicians in America who are skeptical of NATO here in Washington as to why they should remain in it?
Because NATO is a good deal for the United States. It is in the U.S. interest to have a strong NATO. NATO is good for Europe, but it's also good for North America and the United States. Because it makes the United States stronger and safer. No other major power has what the US has in NATO, 31 friends and allies. Russia doesn't have that, China doesn't have that. And of course the US is big. US represents 25% of the world's GDP, the world economy, global economy. But together with NATO allies, we together represent 50%, twice as much of the world's economic might and 50% of the world's military might. So the US is stronger when they are together with friends and allies in NATO. And the US is concerned about the rise of China. Well, then it's important to keep your friends close, as we do in NATO. The US has never gone to war alone. From the Korea War to Afghanistan, we had allies fighting shoulder to shoulder with the US soldiers. In Afghanistan, hundreds of thousands of Canadian and European soldiers were deployed over the years, and more than 1,000 paid the ultimate price. And the only time we have invoked Article 5, our collective defense clause, was after an attack on the United States. So all of this demonstrates that even though the United States have two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, protecting it, they need a strong alliance in the age of ballistic missiles, of submarines, of global competition. The U.S. needs friends. It's good for the U.S. And I'm glad to see that there's an overwhelming majority in the U.S. Congress, but also in the U.S. public, based on opinion polls, in support of NATO. Yeah. If I can add one more thing, and that is that the criticism we have heard from the U.S., actually from different presidents, from President Obama, from President Trump, and also from President Biden, has not been against NATO. Yeah. It has been against NATO allies not spending enough on NATO. And that's a fair point to make. The good news is that NATO allies in Europe and Canada have now really stepped up. Yeah. So that has changed. And therefore I'm confident that the US will continue to recognize the importance of NATO for their national security interests, and therefore continue to be a loyal NATO ally.
Time for one final question, if we may. You will, I think, be remembered by history as one of the most significant Secretary Generals of NATO. You've been there for a long time, but it's not just because you've been there for a long time, it's because you've faced many difficult challenges in a particularly tumultuous period of NATO history. I really hope that you'll write your memoirs and that you won't take on a new job which will prevent you from doing that, because I think everybody would be so fascinated to get your insights. But would you accept Secretary General, in a final comment, to share with us at least some reminiscences of the high points, if you did sit down to write your memoirs, what would be the strong experiences, maybe one or two particular moments of your NATO history that will stay in your memory always?
It's always very hard to make that kind of lists, but of course the war in Ukraine, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, but also of course the annexation back in 2014 and everything that has happened in Ukraine over these 10 years I've been Secretary General. Afghanistan, that was NATO's biggest operation. Several thousand NATO soldiers, US soldiers, but also soldiers from other NATO countries have lost their lives there. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan was dramatic and extremely difficult. And then, of course, there are also high points. I'm extremely honored to be the first Secretary General to have been in charge of 4 rounds of NATO enlargement. That's right. First, Montenegro, then a couple of years after, North Macedonia, and then last year Finland, and then this year Sweden, demonstrating NATO's door remains firmly open. And then of course, just to be the first Secretary General to also speak to the joint session of the U.S. Congress. Yeah. That was a great honor, I have to admit that. And the speech where I started to make some jokes about Norsemen being the first to get to North America, demonstrates in a way the importance of the transatlantic link between North America and Europe for NATO.
Madam Speaker, Mr. Vice President, honorable members of the United States Congress, ladies and gentlemen. I am really, truly honored and grateful for the privilege of addressing you all today. Yesterday, as I flew over the Atlantic, I looked out of my window at the ocean below. The great ocean that lies between our 2 continents. The Atlantic does not divide us. It unites us. It binds us together. And for Norwegians like me, the Atlantic Ocean defines who we are. Indeed, it was a Norseman, Leif Erikson, who was the first European to reach American shores. Almost 1,000 years ago. A fact more people would know if you hadn't left so quickly and decided not to tell anyone about it. So the NATO alliance is not only the longest lasting alliance in history, it is the most successful alliance in history. Madam Speaker, Mr. Vice President, it is good to have friends. Thank you.
During these years, we have been able to really change NATO, also to adapt NATO, to make NATO so much stronger, reflected in defense spending, but also more forces, more readiness, battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance for the first time in our history. That's also a kind of high point that NATO was able to adapt. So NATO is the most successful alliance in history for 2 reasons. One is that we have been able to stand together, despite the fact that we are different and we disagree on some issues. We all stand together on our core task to protect each other. But the other reason why NATO is the most successful alliance in history, and that so many countries would like to join, is that we have been able to change, adapt. For 40 years we did one thing, we deterred the Soviet Union in Europe. Then the Cold War ended, and people said, well, NATO either had to go out of business or out of area, and we went out of area. for the first time, we did something outside NATO territory. We helped to end 2 brutal ethnic wars in the Balkans, in Bosnia and Serbia, Kosovo. And then after 9/11, we adapted again. We have been at the forefront fighting ISIS, Al-Qaeda, terrorism. And then now we are in a way back to our core mission again, collective defense, deterring Russia, and also addressing the challenges coming from China. So, and cyber and hybrid and all these new space, all these new things. So that NATO is able to adapt, and for me to witness and be part of that adaptation for these 10 years has been really an honor and a privilege.
Well, Secretary General, with such a rich mandate, at least in terms of everything you've had to handle, I'm not sure if later on you'll miss it or have been glad to have handed it over to somebody else. But I suppose the definition of success for anybody in a job as important as yours is that you leave the organisation stronger and even more vibrant than when you found it. And I dare say personally that that's certainly going to be history's verdict on you. Secretary General, it's been great to have you. Thank you so much for coming along this morning.
Thank you so much it was nice seeing you again, and it was nice speaking to you, Mr. Secretary General.
Secretary General, we greatly enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it too. And I hope you'll also follow the podcast that we hope to record throughout the rest of the year on NATO's rich history. And they will be as enjoyable as this one has been. Thank you again, Secretary General. And all the very best for the summit and everything else.
And thank you so much for inviting me. And I promise to follow this podcast, NATO Through Time. It's a great podcast.
Thank you.
You're a pro. Have you been doing this a long time?
Ben, I'm 70. I've had a lot of time
just kidding.
I've had a lot of time to pro, believe me. So that was it. We had a good conversation with the Secretary General. He seemed to be on good form today. And what did you make of it all? I mean, obviously, he's lived through a lot of history, right?
Yeah, he's very well spoken. Of course, the Secretary General, of course, he's well spoken, but I thought his answers were fascinating, particularly about his evolution of views and how they changed over time. Because I think it's a tale that most young people follow, right? Where they almost, in a sense, rebel against their parents, only to either later on come around to their parents' views, usually because they realize, as much as we don't want to admit it, our parents were right. I thought that was so fascinating, and I thought it was very personalizing.
But what I found interesting also, the things he's proud about, true, I didn't think of this, but he's the Secretary General who's witnessed the largest number of NATO enlargements, at least in terms of successive waves, with all of those countries coming in. And he reminded us, particularly at a time when NATO's been so preoccupied with Ukraine and Russia, that he's had to deal with a lot of other things as well, right? The terrorist attacks, the Middle East situation, Afghanistan, of course, which was a really sort of tough mission as well. He talked about the Asia Pacific. So you really got a sense of, how broad the agenda is that he has to deal with, all of the balls he has to juggle in the air on any particular day in the office.
The job feels like a lot of juggling, right? I mean, you have to appease 32 different countries. I can't even get a friend group of 7 people to show up to a gathering. I don't know how he's doing it with 32 countries.
Well, one thing, Ben, which I would like to thank you for, is that, obviously the Secretary General is always, on the record. He has to give so many communications. He has to talk about NATO. He rarely talks about himself. And what we wanted to do today was to get a sense of the man and not just the role, of course, the position. Right. And I like to say thanks to you, because I thought that, you managed to sort of open that side of him up very well, and we had a great conversation where he really sort of shared very openly with us his sort of impressions.
I was surprised to see him open up like that, but I'm glad we got him to do so.
Well, let's hope that together and with our other co-hosts, we could be hopefully as successful in the future podcasts with our guests in the future at getting them to be as frank and open as well. But Ben, thanks again for being with us today.
Yep, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again, dear audience, for listening and being with us. And please tune into our next podcast very soon. But from NATO headquarters in Brussels for today, goodbye.